Okay. If you can find some known speakers for the conference, and I can ask Fabien potentially for Sicily or the guys from Drupal. If you'd like to come along.
There was a Drupal bootcamp about 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
I didn't know that.
I'm pretty new. It's my first time in Australia and Sydney. Trying to learn a bit. Oh, I'm not living here. I'm just here for my business for 2 weeks. So I was.
It sounds like you're here, right?
No. Okay.
That's flat. No, it doesn't get you anywhere.
Because if you don't hear my French accent, I think so you have to take your way over. Depending on the time of the day, I have a German or French accent, so, but definitely not Aussie.
So what's different from France?
But I don't do it. No, I didn't.
So your business is basically
Is it your business or is it you joined the Bangkok office? Are you like a local employee or are you an expat?
yeah.
You're an expat? Yeah, okay.
I can go pretty much wherever I want. And I came to this part of the world for the first time 1.5 years ago, and I had to choose between Singapore and Bangkok, and Singapore is very boring, so I mean, it's nice, but it's expensive and cannot do anything. And the next city was Bangkok, and I had a good connection to go everywhere. There is a lot. Definitely cheaper than here.
It doesn't take much to be cheaper than Sydney, it's crazy.
It was like, wow. And you have a lot of technical starters. You have many people from Australia. Surprised me all the time.
You grab that, I'll just grab it.
Awesome. Hi everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jess. I'm with Anchor. Tonight we have Christian. Christian is a CTO at Anchor, and he'll be discussing the concepts and practices of continuous delivery and its success with Bend & Lingerie and Playboy. Just the housekeeping notes. There's the male bathroom right behind you over there. Females on the other side of the lifts. If you need to leave the building, the big glass doors will lock behind you, so make sure you tell someone where you're going. Big thanks to our sponsors, Anchor, who are supplying the beer, pizza and the venue, and also PayPal and Braintree. Wi-Fi is available. You've probably seen the signs around, so if you want to use the Wi-Fi, Ken has Wi-Fi and the password is yes you can. So a bit of information on AWEA. We had the Web Awards last week that was held at the Menzies. The full list of winners on the website, which you can check out on the screen there. Entries for next year will be open soon, so if you know a website who should be entered in the Web Awards, please submit it on that site. And we're also looking for judges, so if you'd like to be a judge at the next year's Web Awards, enter on there as well. Okay, so this is just a list of the meetup groups who are associated with Squad 80. Feel free to go along to any of them or contact the people on screen for more information. They're also listed on meetup.com as well. Hiring, Anchor, we're always looking for talented sysadmins, a CSR and web developers with a taste for Haskell. So if you know anyone, speak to Bart or any of the guys here with Anchor. So I'll now hand over to Christian. Christian's got 8 years experience in Linux system administration, and he also led the team behind Apple's test flight. Christian.
Can you hear me, Katie?
No.
All right. That's good.
Yes, sir. Always, sir.
All right. Why am I here? I say this from your perspective. If you've asked yourself any of these questions, you might want to stick around for a little while and bear with me talking at you for the next little bit. I'll go through concepts of software delivery, testing, what the hell DevOps actually is, delivery pipelines, and more importantly, lingerie models and how this worked for them. A better question to ask yourself and a better reason to stick around is to ask the question, how can I minimize the time from my idea to market? And that's really what we're getting at, and that's the crux of the presentation. So, let's go back a little ways, or even maybe just to yesterday. We talk about releasing software. It can be a complicated process, but it can be quite simple. I would call this its infancy, and I'll say and prefix to say that if you're doing any of these today, you should feel that. All of these really lack methodology, but they are common ideas and common mechanisms that we see. We have the privilege as a hosting provider to see many good and bad mechanisms for delivering software. So these are kinds of the things that generally customers have done, will do, and continue to do, but they result in suboptimal experience, a suboptimal product, and really a lot of risk into a product as well. So these are generally things that you want to avoid. Let's move to a more practical example. I'm sure everyone has heard of waterfall methodology and how it applies to software delivery. This is, again, more relevant and hopefully a little bit more representative of the people in the room today. I'm hoping that everyone has familiarity with the idea and process. Essentially to say that you treat the project and the product as one big monolithic piece of software. You go through from idea to requirements, you develop it, and finally you release it after a bit of testing. Now, the general problems with this approach is that your releases are often infrequent. Your time to market is also slow. If you consider this methodology in context of maybe releasing software 10 years ago, where you buy Adobe Photoshop on a CD or something like that. So if you can imagine that Photoshop got released once every couple of years, there would be a long cycle process to release, to develop that new piece of software. Go through testing stages, finally burn a CD, put it in the shop, you go and buy it. But after that, not a lot changes. And we start through the process again. It means that Adobe needs to release a fix or a patch. The delivery mechanism is perhaps a CD, or perhaps we do have the internet and we can apply patches that way, but generally customers aren't going to receive those updates in a timely manner, or even at all, unless they opt in. So, if we pull this process apart, we realize that information only flows one way. Consider this in the practice of web development. You have your requirements phase. This all goes down, design, that's cool. Implementation is probably what we'd refer to as development. So this is a stage where developers have received requirements from their customer, they have received a spec, and they now need to go and make it a reality. That's all fine, but when we get right down to the end, we get to maintenance and release, which means it's now in the hands of an operations member. As a hosting provider, I am a sysadmin, I work with sysadmins. We're the ones at the end of this tail, but we often don't have a lot of feedback back into the start of the process where the customer is. And if we can see something that's suboptimal today, I've got no mechanism or available way that I can use to go back to the customer and say, hey, operationally, your product could be a lot better if you just had this next thing, this had this little bit extra, or maybe it would be a lot more stable. And that's generally what my perspective is, that's what my interest is, but the interests of all the actors in this model are very different. So again, we tie it back to infrequent releases, slow release to market, and this isn't necessarily a feature of waterfall methodology, but often went hand in hand. A lack of automation. So you'd often have a release go through a bunch of testing teams, they'd sign off, they'd have a few various processes whereby they take it through different environments to get there. But this would generally be a whole bunch of people sitting in a team who would just go through and click buttons all day and functionally test the application for you, which in today's quick-paced environment, I hate using that term, but today's environment, that wouldn't really work. You can't afford to have a team of half a dozen testers sitting there validating every feature release to your website, especially when all you want to do is change a button. So moving to today, we've adopted some slightly more mature practices like Agile development, which is very big on iterating quickly and having tight feedback loops. It means the process becomes circular and iterative, and we have a better mechanism whereby we can feedback our experience into the system and hopefully get a better result long term. This means, especially in today's age, I gave the example before of Adobe releasing software on the CD. You've now got the internet. You can release the software immediately. You just have to hit publish or something to that effect. We have this concept now of software as a service. More commonly, you might just use the term website. Software as a service was a nice term that marketers came up with to make it seem more appealing, but consider that any website is software as a service. And anytime you change code or release software onto the internet, it is software as a service. So, I now have a mechanism where I can release products to my market immediately. How do I ensure the quality? So, I spoke before of that team of half a dozen human testers sitting there clicking buttons all day. That's great, but if I want to get there quickly, then I need to have a reliable and quick mechanism whereby I can validate that the code that I release is going to be up to the standard of the previous release and so on. I need to make sure that I don't damage my customer experience by releasing bad software. If I release a new feature that degrades performance of my website by 50%, I may not see or expose that immediately, but it's definitely going to have a flow and impact on my revenue in future. So, the practices we have adopted, despite seeming risk, have actually increased quality. And we've done this by releasing often and having capabilities in place whereby we can roll back immediately and, more importantly, automatically perform all of the actions in this process. Automation is king, and that applies to every step of the process. So I'm not just talking about this testing phase, but even just if you consider the process of rolling your release into a testing or staging environment, or a developer just conducting some unit tests, they all need to be automated so that you can get to market more quickly. We can't have humans in the way. So quality. How do we ensure quality? I spoke before about automation, but I should speak more about the types of testing we can do. We start with the unit tests. So these are tests you'll actually bake into code, and you'll say, functionally, does this portion of code actually, when I input X, does it spit out Y? And there are a lot more complexities to this process, but it is essentially validating the code pathway does what the developer expects it's going to do. We should do this every time we make a change to the code, because that way we know that all the previous features and functionality we've put in, again, behave the way the developer expects. Acceptance tests are a different kind of testing. They actually validate your application works the way that the customer thinks it should work, rather than the way the developer thinks it should work. So these might be things whereby you, in the context of an e-commerce store, have maybe simulated a customer who goes through and adds an item to their shopping cart, checks out, and they get a receipt sent to them via mail. That is a fairly long and complex process, but might represent an acceptance test for a customer, and probably is a very important one to validate in an e-commerce context. And finally, system tests. So this tests the system as a whole. If you imagine that a web application might represent a cluster of machines behind it, you want to make sure that all the ancillary infrastructure, like your load balancers, file storage, things like that, all work in tandem and are going to work not only in your test environment but also in production, and aren't going to conflict with the new application code or new behavior of an application after you've changed it. So, we now have two conflicting views. We've got sysadmins who are responsible for maintaining the system, for ensuring its availability, and for ensuring it can scale under load. You've then got developers who are responsible for releasing features quickly and often releasing them on quick deadlines. If you imagine that change is the catalyst for things breaking, then you can see that these two groups are often at odds. You'll have your developers trying to push things into production because they have a customer behind them or a project manager saying, we need this in there now. And you'll have the sysadmin saying, please don't change it. The last time you changed it, it broke at 3 a.m. on Sunday, and I don't want to get working on it. So the interests of these two parties are very different. And yeah, as you might imagine, sysadmins become a blocker to progress. So you'll end up with developers trying to find ways around them, both technically and at a business level. And if you have developers circumventing the people who are responsible for the infrastructure going forward, then you end up with a very sorry state of affairs. So on DevOps. This is a cultural shift, and it's an idea. And I'd like to make this clear to people I come across because I see so many job advertisements these days. It's not a job title, and it's not something you can buy off the shelf. You can't hire a DevOps engineer to do your DevOps, and you can't buy a DevOps product to get DevOps capabilities. It's not the idea. The idea here is to make your sysadmins and your operators, or developers and your sysadmins work in collaboration. This means actually tying them to the same metrics and making them interested in the same goals. We want to ensure that the measure of success for both parties is actually the same, and that is a working system. So ideally, we share responsibility between the two parties. You don't have separate teams, you don't throw things over the fence. You get actually cross-functional teams that contain both dev and ops, and you actually bridge that gap, and you make sure that the operator is actually involved in the development process and can feedback his experience into the start of that process we spoke about earlier. And likewise, the developer can see the operational impact that their change in the application has made. They might not realize that deploying feature X has decreased performance. It's probably interesting for them to know. So pipelines. There are a few concepts here which we should probably clear up, and they often get confused. So we've got CI, CD, and CD. The last two are especially close and confusing. Continuous integration, I won't go too much into, is more of a development practice. The idea here being that you don't actually, assume you're working out a revision control system, you don't actually sit and work off an isolated feature branch for the next month. You should actually be committing your changes back into mainline as often as possible. The idea here being that all the developers are working back to a single branch, and you know that you're not going to have any messy conflicts later on, and you're not going to have any build problems by a spurious commit from another developer that happened last month. You should expose these as immediately as possible. I won't go too much further into that. It's just simply to say it's more of a development practice than a deployment pipeline, but it can tie into that process. Continuous delivery is probably what we're more interested in for the purposes of this talk, and is the approach that was adopted by Ben and Lingerie. So if you imagine, we want to establish a pipeline from getting our code from idea to production, or as close thereto. So product manager comes along and says, all right, we need to add a widget to the website. Developer, please make me a widget. Developer goes and codes up the feature, gets it into a state where he's happy to merge it back into mainline. We then want to make it such that there are as few steps as possible to getting that build tested and released into either a staging environment or finally production. So if you imagine continuous delivery as being an automated pipeline from the developer's commit all the way to your test environment. But you might then want to say, all right, I want the customer to sign off to say the widget looks the way they want. So you then say, all right, we've gone through all of this process, let's stop here, have a manual gate so a customer can sign off and press the button to say, yes, this is production ready. Continuous deployment is a lot more scary. The idea whereby a developer can hit a commit button, hit a push button, and that will go immediately through to production. Now, this might seem particularly scary, but the idea here is that you have enough automation and enough testing in place at very many layers and aspects of the system, such that you're confident that on that push, that if there is a problem, it will be exposed before it ever reaches production. So a lot of startups and a lot of San Francisco-based tech companies that are quite successful today adopt one of these two practices depending on their business requirements. One isn't an example of a more mature process than another. It's simply a different business context. So Playboy, what did they do and why did this matter? We had a digital agency come to us, the Playboy website client. So they had plans to have an aggressive product launch in collaboration with Bendon Lingerie. So the Playboy line of lingerie sounded pretty appealing to us. All right. So they came to us, and one of the huge requirements they said was that performance and scalability of the system were vital. They'd seen a lot of competitor product launches whereby they'd gone out and announced it, and then the infrastructure had fallen over 5 minutes later. Obviously, the perspective from users is quite damaged, and you're not actually getting your product to your physical product out to your customers because they can't actually use your system. And finally, they said we can't have long feature cycles. That means that they needed to be able to change the website in a very short order of time with confidence that that would work. So we worked in close collaboration with the agency that came to us, that was Playhouse Digital, to establish a system that would work both for them as developers as well as us as operations staff. And again, it goes back to the concepts I told you before. Our measures of success now are tied into each other. We're not working against each other anymore. So if you imagine we're establishing a pipeline, the first step we might have is to generate an artifact. Now, an artifact you can think of simply as a unit of code that has been built in some way. So a developer has gone along and released a new feature. We now want to reliably build that, and we want to build it once. The idea being is that if I build it multiple times, I'm introducing potential change into that system by building it in a different way or building it in a different place. So I want to make sure that it's built once. So the first step in facilitating them was to have a reliable and automated mechanism such that when a developer sent out some code, we could build an artifact on that basis. And we didn't want to give them much or many onerous processes, so it's had to be as closely tied into their existing pipelines as possible. So we said, all right, we'll just work with your existing revision control. So we actually tie into the Bitbucket repositories, and we say, all right, every time you do a push to this branch, you then set off a sequence of events that will generate a build artifact. And that's all that happens at this point. We just want to make sure that that build is available as a release. It's a unit of work that we can then do something with later. And what's interesting in this context is that generally a build artifact might be something like a package or a piece of software that's in a tarball. In our example here, we actually decided the entire machine is the build artifact. So the machine itself is immutable and unchanging rather than just the software on it. So we also need to test our artifacts. We want to make sure that, again, going back to that process I spoke of before, where the developer is going directly into production, we want to make sure that we have a lot of gateways and checks. So we need to ensure that failed tests meet failed builds, and we don't generate any artifacts that are going to result in failed unit tests at a later date. This doesn't yet encompass the other testing I spoke of, which would be the acceptance and the system testing. So, we want to deploy to staging. We have our build artifact, which you think of just a unit of code. It contains our new feature. Now, generally, and established practice says you should stick this in a staging environment. Staging environments are generally quite expensive to run, and they will, over time, diverge from production. As much as you try not to, they'll be different over time. So, we now have these concepts like infrastructure as code. I can actually define in configuration language what my infrastructure looks like now. So rather than have that staging environment sit there for the entirety of its lifetime unused and only used when we do testing, why don't I just build it when I need it, and build it when the developer wants it, or build it when the customer wants it? So we now have this point whereby the agency or the customer can come along and say, yes, I wish to stage this release. And rather than having an idle environment sitting there costing them money, they say, give me staging environment now. We build that on the fly. Takes about 10 minutes, which is it's a very acceptable time for them. And we end up with something that isn't production-like or production equivalent or functionally equivalent. We end up with something that was built from the exact same code and basis as production was, which means it's identical every time. And the beauty of this system is that we can actually do it multiple times. So I could have staging 1, 2, 3, 4 if I liked. I could be testing multiple feature releases in parallel. Say I wanted to compare the performance of one feature to the next, or one feature implementation to another. Two developers have two different ideas. This means that I can do this all on something that is exactly production, and then decide on that basis what then goes into production later. So, the points I made just then. The important part to note here is that it's repeatable, and it's also automatic. So this means that it's all up to the customer. They don't need to engage us as operations staff to say, please load the latest production database so that I have relevant data. That all happens on the fly when they create the environment in line with what their business requirements are. And it's cost effective because they're only paying for it for as long as they want to do testing. And when they're done, they turn it off. So this means that our system tests are now relevant because we're hitting a system that's the same. It means that we're not going to be caught up with the nuances of a clustered environment versus, say, using a single machine. means that our performance tests, more importantly, are relevant. And this was very important to the customer. They wanted to make sure that any time they changed the code or released a feature, that performance wasn't going to be degraded, or the scalability of the system wasn't going to be degraded. Consider that if your transaction throughput halves by releasing that feature, then you might want to reconsider whether you release it. And finally, we provide the customer an isolated interface to actually review and sign these builds off. So when they're happy, they can click the button, but before that, nothing happens. And then we have the production deploy. So we've gone through this long, arduous process of the developer hitting git push and the customer saying, yeah, that's cool. We now say, all right, we want to put this release into production. We use the exact same build artifact. So we don't go and change code in place. We don't go and build the code again. We use the same build artifact, the same machine image in this circumstance to load into production. So it's the same thing we put into staging, and it's the exact same process. It means that we can repeat this process as many times as we like. I can load that same release as many times as I like if I really want to. And it means that the rollback process, again, is just as simple. It's just a command line tool chain away. And finally, the deployment process that we've baked into this system is atomic. So the customer can safely release software, knowing that because we've used the same artifact in staging, it's going to look the same in production. And likewise, the cutover process happens all at once. So we're not stuck with any weird downtime issues as a result of the fact that we want to release our feature at midday. This is sort of what an end-to-end pipeline looks like. Looks a little bit complex, but really isn't. Essentially summarizes the fact that from the developer's code commit, we can go all the way through to a staging environment without any interference from a sysadmin. It also means that the developer or customer is in control and can put gates at any stage of the process, as well as tests at any stage of the process to ensure that the releases they're putting into production is high quality. This means that a customer can have more confidence in a release going into production, and likewise, they know that the quality of the software is maintained. And with those two things, we know that we can release quite frequently. This means that if my competitor I know is releasing its new widget, I can release mine today. So, what benefits did the customer get? I think the most important one for me there is happy sysadmins. The most important one for the customer was reduced risk and reduced time to market. So the system enabled them to easily and readily test new features in advance of their launch, and now post-launch it's very trivial for them to add new functionality to their property. So, what now? First up to say I lied with the title. It's not child's play, and there is a lot of complexity. If you take one thing away, it would be to use test, and probably the second thing is automate as much as you can. The advice I would give you is that if you find a process to be hard, don't avoid it, do it as much as possible. This means that you'll either be encouraged to automate it or eliminate it. It means a better result for you. The other thing I'll stress is that feedback loops are vital. So you need to ensure that at any stage of the process and at any stage of your pipeline, you get feedback as to what's happening. If a build fails halfway through, a developer should know immediately and immediately, and also have a lot of information about what went wrong and why, so that they can fix that. And finally, encourage collaboration between your development and operations teams. So don't get into the mindset of, okay, we throw this release over the fence and it's their problem. And likewise, operations staff shouldn't be in the mindset of, oh, those damn devs are going to break it again. They should be tied to the same outcomes, and they should be working together. And that's it.
I was just pointing out there was no lingerie.
Yes.
Make sure you didn't miss a slide.
Yes.
What was, considering there's also a lot of tools for different pieces of this, what was the hardest challenge for you guys in putting them together?
I think actually the challenge was a business one, and that is to say that we actually, as sysadmins, developed a lot of the tooling and systems behind this, and a lot of the time we're trying to preempt what our customer was actually asking for or what they would need. We had some high-level requirements, but we didn't actually adopt our own practices in terms of shortening that feedback loop to go back to them and say, hey, would this be useful to you? And we got a fair way down the path before we went back at one point and said, hey, would this be useful? And got some very interesting feedback that didn't necessarily invalidate what we had done, but we might have had a better result up front or in advance had we simply gone to them and said, is this relevant?
Skip over me. As a marketer, so forget the DevOps, the sysadmin. So say if I'm a marketer, how would this actually help me? So say if everything just went over my head completely just now, how would this help my business? So I don't care about sysadmins. I don't care about DevOps. I just want the SLA. I just want my site up. I just want to make money. I can care less. How does this help my business? Because yes, it is falling over. Yes, I got fights going on in DevOps and systems and operations. How can you help me with this solution?
Yeah, so there's two things there, really. The first is that if you do need to have an advantage over your competitor and you do want to get your feature to market more quickly, a process like this will enable you to do that. And the second component of that is that a process like this will enable you to do that in a higher quality fashion. It means that you won't end up with any regressions that you introduced the last time you released another feature. And likewise, your customer's experience will be further enhanced because you're releasing higher quality software.
What do you do for markup?
No, I'm just saying.
You want a website, for example. What
No,
do you
I
use?
know the answer. I just asked that question. So.
Because it was like,
It was planned, don't worry.
I like to.
Sorry, just did.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like, for example, a tool, maybe like an open source tool like Jenkins, does it cover a lot of the techniques or processes that we talked about in this presentation?
So definitely a tool like Jenkins is relevant in this circumstance, but if you consider Jenkins will allow you to do a lot of build automation and unit tests,
Yes.
but it doesn't necessarily cover the end of that pipeline process, which is actually getting it into your staging environment and getting it into production. So you can tie in things like Capistrano to orchestrate that.
Right.
Yep.
Yeah.
But the system we've developed here actually lets us do it in a more repeatable way and actually a more relevant way, because you don't have this static staging environment sitting there decaying through entropy. It doesn't become different from production. We actually build it on the fly and say, here it is available. So the two concepts are not mutually exclusive. I actually would love for a customer, or for this customer, to tie that back into a CI system like Jenkins,
Right,
or Bamboo, whatever.
Yeah.
And it certainly has the interfaces whereby it could facilitate that. It simply becomes a call to the system rather than to your Capistrano script.
Right.
What was the technology stack for this project, and was that a factor in enabling this kind of continuous delivery process? And does Anchor support how many different types of tech stacks are supported at Anchor for doing this kind of process?
So this is unfortunately a PHP stack.
Don't apologize for that.
And why do we want to apologize for that? I mean, it's
I apologize to the world for allowing developers to release more PHP.
Could be worse, could be .NET.
Fair point. Yeah, the tech stack was PHP, and that was simply based on customer requirement. I do want to replicate this model because I think that as a generic idea, it is applicable to other customers and definitely to other technologies. But PHP is where it's at right now.
Ruby and Rails?
Rails is actually next to my list of goals.
Nice.
Two questions. So first of all is, can you replicate this for Windows-based servers and .NET applications and stuff?
Oh, look at that.
Yes.
Abstract.
Oh man, all the views now.
Time to go, everyone.
Etsy, I'll let you answer that first.
You can. You can do that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a yes, Christian.
Sorry, the question was, can we do .NET applications as examples?
Can you replicate onto Windows and easily?
Even with PHP.
I think it's feasible. Obviously, my background is in Linux, and one of the big features and pain points in this system is actually generating the images. So there's build artifacts I told you about. I believe there are systems in place that can let you do that for Windows, but I have not looked at them, and I don't know how mature they are or how feasible they are to use.
I mean, I can help you from the Windows side and PHP.
Okay.
And you can use exactly the same tools. Even Jenkins, you can use Git. and everything. We actually do pretty much the same thing for PHP itself on Windows. So we do the same kind of testing for the PHP release on Windows, and we test it with, I don't know, 150 or something like that application for every PHP release. So we do pretty much the same.
Okay.
And also on Linux, but we do that on all platforms. So.
Thank you.
Was
Sorry,
this
yes.
so? Was this based on cloud or was this based on physical servers?
So this is definitely cloud. So utility building, having API-driven infrastructure was definitely a big requirement for this. And not to say that that's mutually exclusive with physical infrastructure these days, but that was definitely the easier option for us to approach.
When you made your new builds or your testing servers, when you deployed and you said the customer will hit go, did that effectively just do a DNS shift to the new server, or basically route internally? How did you do that routing to basically then have the new customers going to the new box with the new code on it?
So you're right. So internally, the traffic gets shifted at a DNS level.
Okay.
External customers don't see.
Yeah, no, the external customers don't notice, but obviously just internally how that was working.
Yep. Yes.
So for this particular project, I'm just wondering how many man hours does it take to build something like this?
Quite a few. So had we isolated ourselves to simply developing this for the one customer, then I think the development timeline would have been a lot shorter. But obviously, as an organisation, we saw the opportunity to reuse, and we thought it was applicable to other customers. So we've had 3 to 4 people working on this, I'd say, for the past 4 or 5 months.
Okay, so it's very, very significant.
Yeah, but it's not to say that the tool and the system wasn't ready beforehand. It's simply a case of now iteratively adding features.
Okay.
I'm just wondering, probably I missed your presentations. I don't see any peer reviewing process in the system, or is it part of the continuous integrations, or you don't do peer reviewing at all in terms of the code?
So I told this story more from my side. So I am the sysadmin. Internally, as a development agency, I know that Playhouse Digital does do peer review, so that is part of their process. But that's simply a case of enabling that as a business process somewhere along the way before the automated deployment pipeline starts. Yep.
How do you deal with databases changes for the databases? If you, for example, you're saying you have a new feature, so you may have to change the database. You do snapshots as well, or because especially for the rollback, let's say you have a mistake and you have to roll back.
Yeah, so we do facilitate that through snapshots.
Okay.
That's the mechanism for both creating new environments as well as to-be rollbacks. But the rollbacks are really only relevant in a non-production context. Consider in a production context if you have an e-commerce site, as example, if you get a transaction come through, you can't roll back.
Really glad you're able to make the distinguish the difference between delivery and deployment, which is often confused in a lot of the organisations I've worked with. What factors went into actually convincing the business to buy into this kind of strategy? Because the distinction between delivery and deployment has often been a big sort of concern or question over actually rolling this out to production environments.
To be honest, that actually wasn't a sale that I had to make, which is fortunate.
Is that to say they were already bought into the process coming on board?
I think largely they were, but likewise, as I mentioned, we were engaged by the agency who then had the customer, and I think it was the customer who was driving these ideas and these requirements, but we were quite happy to work with the agency to actually make them a reality.
Okay.
With this, as well as creating staging environments, are you also doing anything to facilitate development environments?
So we treat them as the same idea. So instead of saying give me staging, we say give me Deb, or give me Bob, or give me Alice. The only caveat, of course, is that it's all utility-driven infrastructure, which means it costs you money while it's turned on. Cool. Thank you, everyone.
where we collaborate with a few of the other meetup groups that were on the screen earlier. Keep your eye on the meetup page and social media for details on that. Pizza should be here any minute, so hang around, have a drink, and we'll see you next month.
I only expected it to be just this. Especially the whole staging environment we have, for example, we've got 3 features. We've got 3 developers, and every developer a feature that they want to be able to get sign off on. Maybe you have to do it in order. So you have one version to mainline master, which is staging, staging